Bitcoin is going through a super interesting time right now. We recently had a soft fork that has, I guess, become essentially a hard fork or a planned hard fork of the original time chain with a proof of work change. So I'm not going to get too into the weeds on kind of why this happened, how it happened. I'm sure most of the people watching this video are probably aware of what BIP-110 was and kind of its original intended purpose versus what actually happened, attempted to activate on the main core chain. I'm not going to try and pick sides too much here because I really think there's an opportunity essentially for both to potentially prosper over the next little bit. I don't know long term if one chain will necessarily beat out the other. I definitely see some of the messaging behind the BIP-110 RDTS guys and kind of the reasoning behind why they're doing it. I totally understand that, especially if you've ever tried to run a Bitcoin node and you have to wait and see how long it takes to sync and how much data it uses. And that's kind of amplified by all of these data centers also swallowing up all of the NAND chips. 2 terabyte SSDs, if you haven't checked the price of those recently, which at this point, if you want to run an unpruned Bitcoin node, pretty much everyone recommends 2 terabytes so you have any kind of overhead at all. And with the amount of spam, I will agree, it is spam on the core chain that is happening with ordinals and inscriptions and that sort of thing. That's going to get swallowed up very, very quickly, especially as Bitcoin sees more adoption. That's a big problem. The BIP-110 guys seemed to agree with that, and they tried to find a fix through a consensus change that didn't happen because here's the issue, okay? The financial incentive for miners to activate the UASF that was BIP-110 wasn't there because the transactions that generate the fees are the expensive large ones like ordinals and inscriptions. Essentially, they would be chopping their own paychecks apart only to prevent spam. But if they have the means to run a node with several hundred terabytes of overhead because they have the money to, unlike small-time miners or small-time people wanting to run a node to decentralize the network, you can quickly understand how people could get priced out of running nodes. And I see why that's a concern from a decentralization standpoint, especially when you look at the way hash rate on the main core chain is distributed now. I mean, between Foundry, F2 pool, and Ant pool, that's like almost 45% of the network or something like that. And correct me if I'm wrong in the comments there, but I believe Foundry alone is like 26% of all of the blocks mined currently anyway. That's insane numbers. And the only time I can ever think of something like that happening that I've seen in history was back in like 2014 or something like that. There was a mining pool that got to 51% of the hash rate of Bitcoin actually, and pretty much everyone Cypherpunks were not happy about that one. They started DDoSing their mining pools and things like that, and that eventually came to an end. But you probably couldn't see something exactly like that today. I don't think you could see a single pool ever hit 51% again. But you could very well see what people like Luke Dasher are claiming is what happened, where the miner or the mining pools colluded in some way to prevent soft forks from activating. That's their claim. So circling back to BIP-110, since that failed to activate, we essentially have 2 Bitcoin blockchains now. We have one predominantly controlled by Foundry, Ant pool, F2 pool, Spider pool, Luxor, those kinds of people. And then we have the BIP-110 chain, where following this fork, the only people that have submitted blocks are Roughnecks using a datum node. Datum and a knots node, I should say, running BIP-110, because the BIP-110 chain can only validate blocks from nodes that are signaling BIP-110 now. So this has led us to a situation where, and I'm sure this is probably not super visible for everybody, but starting on block 961.632, we have 2 time chains now. The big issue is losing a little bit of Ocean's hash rate to the main Bitcoin core network. Not a huge deal to them. Their total hash rate for the entire core chain right now floats around 950 to 956 exahash from what I've seen. The problem is that difficulty of sampling for 960 exahash on the network that difficulty carried over to this chain because it wasn't timed around a difficulty adjustment, and even then, difficulty adjustments are limited in how much they can reduce difficulty in any one change. So the problem they've reached here is they've submitted almost no blocks compared to the core chain since this fork has happened. In total, we have 4 blocks, all from Roughnecks, because they're the only ones submitting any kind of real significant hash rate for the difficulty that it's at currently. From what I've seen, it was floating around 5 to 6 exahash over the last couple days, but right now they're actually sitting at around 48 petahash. Not too sure what happened there, but they seem to have something up with some of their miners. But obviously, with the difficulty we're at now, we're unlikely to see blocks for the next little bit unless they're able to get that hash rate back up. As you can imagine, for a blockchain that's designed to have blocks processed every 10 minutes, that's kind of a problem. So you have to find a way to work around that. If you are one of these people who truly believe in the message of what BIP-110 was about, and you're really willing to die on that hill for your whole stack, you don't want to stop running this new version of knots. This is Bitcoin to these people, or to whoever, and I may have some of these people watching this video. I respect it. I understand where you're coming from. If that's the position you want to take, I'm interested to see where this goes, and I'm might get involved a little bit myself, just out of the sense of there may be a market incentive to do so. If you have your last block on an average 10-minute blockchain being mined 36 hours ago, and the first one since the fork was 5 days ago, and there's only 2 blocks in between there, that's going to be a little bit of a problem for processing transactions. Right here in the mempool for the current block that we're expecting next, it's sitting at 2.078 Bitcoin on the BIP-110 chain in just fees. So not even considering the 3.125 block reward itself. So on this chain of whatever you want to call this, they'd just call it Bitcoin. Some people might call it like BIPcoin or BIP-110 coin or whatever. This fork of Bitcoin, you're looking at about 5.1 something Bitcoin from one block. Obviously, if there ends up being any kind of exchange rate for this coin or this fork that's worth anything, that could be worth something down the road, if you know what I'm saying. So that leads us to the next portion of this, where how do you unstuck a chain that's stuck, right? Really, you have 2 ways you could do this, and if you ask the people around BIP-110, there's really only one real solution here, and that's a proof of work change. Otherwise, you could do a difficulty adjustment, but at that point, you're at risk of a 51% attack if you were to hard fork, manually adjust the difficulty. You could have one of these large mining pools come in and just 51% the whole chain and do whatever they want to it. So just adjusting difficulty and nothing else is not feasible with how large the pool of SHA-256 miners is at this point. So their solution is what they call firing the miners, and by doing so, they are changing the algorithm in which Bitcoin or their Bitcoin is going to be mined with. So to break it down, as many of you probably already know, but we'll just go over the basics here. Bitcoin, since its conception, and the Bitcoin core chain, and currently still the BIP-110 chain, all use SHA-256 hashing algorithms, okay? Use SHA-256, okay? Again, since its inception, Bitcoin has used SHA-256 for its hashing algorithm. When Bitcoin was very first kind of starting to gain some traction amongst cryptographers and that sort of thing, cypherpunks in smaller internet forums, the difficulty was low enough and the total hash rate was small enough that you could solo mine Bitcoin with just a CPU, right? You could do CPU mining, and the difficulty was low enough that you could actually earn Bitcoin with just a processor, essentially, right? Which is kind of crazy for someone like my age to think about. Someone that just had a room of Core 2 duos just ripping Bitcoin, and they'd be a billionaire at this point. It is insane to think about. But anyway, CPU, eventually difficulty got too high. People started farming with GPUs. Graphics cards are a lot better at handling algorithm hashing for things like Bitcoin. And that was until some companies like Antminer, that sort of thing, started to develop ASICs. The whole point of an ASIC is it's a dedicated circuit. It's a dedicated device specifically for one purpose. Application-specific integrated circuit is what ASIC stands for. It took me a second to remember. So you have these application-specific integrated circuits that are specifically designed to do one thing. Receive Stratum V1 jobs from a Bitcoin node or from a mining pool and just hash SHA-256. That's all they can do with SHA-256. So you have millions and millions of dollars of these SHA-256 miners at this point plugged into power grids and the internet all over the world, hashing at 956 pooled exahash on the Bitcoin core chain. There's a lot of these things. That is not feasible to just decrease the difficulty and just hope that a 51% attack doesn't happen. The pool of these miners is simply too large, and the pool of concentration of these miners is simply too large. It's not a risk they're willing to take. It's more specifically, it's not a risk Luke Dasher is willing to take. He's really the one leading this. So they decided they need a algorithm change. Came down to a couple different options. There was like Eagle Song, SHA-3X, a couple different versions of Blake, like Blake2b-Sia or something like that. And eventually what won out through a process of like hashing different blocks from testnet 4 or something. I'm not going to get too into the weeds on it. It was a little messy. I will just leave it at that, I guess. But in the end, the one that ended up winning is Blake2b. Okay? Blake2b is not super common amongst altcoins or altcoin miners. There's only really been a couple coins that have ever utilized a version of it. One of them being Sia coin. Sia. So Sia used a modified version of Blake2b called Blake2b-Sia. So ASICs designed for Blake2b-Sia can only do Blake2b-Sia. So if they're wanting these miners to be compatible with mining their new Bitcoin fork, they need essentially a translation layer between those Blake2b-Sia ASICs and whatever the header on the node is basically providing them with. I do want to give a quick disclaimer here. This project or this hard fork seems to be pretty early in development. We don't even really have confirmation on specific mining hardware that we know for sure is going to be compatible. To my knowledge, pretty much everyone is still waiting on even acquiring these miners to begin testing the code necessary to allow this hard fork to happen. So essentially what their plan is to wrap a header from data. The idea is that miners will have to use structured block templates that only give some of the data to fit within the header space of the Blake2b-Sia miners, and they have to allow them to essentially talk to each other in order to give those generated hashes from the ASICs back over to the nodes if they were to solve a block. So it's a little convoluted. We're barely even getting like templates of what we think the header is going to look like. We don't know if we're going to need to do firmware mods on these miners yet. It's very, very early. It's very, very up in the air on what could happen here and kind of how this is all going to unfold. But in general, there are a couple things that I'd like to kind of get out there for anyone potentially interested in the opportunity to mine this coin, especially early when the difficulty is probably going to be the lowest and you're going to have the best chance of potentially solo mining blocks if that's what you're interested in, or earn the most if you're doing pool mining. So a couple things to keep in mind there. Again, the algorithm is Blake2b-Sia. You might find other Blake2b miners for some other altcoin out there like Alphenium or something like that that used some kind of Blake2b or some derivative of it. Those, to my knowledge, won't work. They're specifically targeting compatibility with Sia block headers, or Sia ASICs in general, I guess I should say. So there's really, to my knowledge, only 3 real players in the Sia mining game right now. And I say that loosely because none of them seem to really be in it anymore. Obviously, some ASIC chips for these still float around. It's still possible to get chips, like in a roll for... Okay. As I was saying, it's still possible to get chips like on a roll for Blake2b, but you're really not going to see a lot of them in production right now. I'm sure it still kind of exists. But anyways, you have 3 real players. You have Gold Shell, you have IB Link, and you have Antminer. I'm not going to list off all the specific models for each. There's quite a few. If you're looking for something cheap that you can run at home on a basic 110 volt outlet, Gold Shell is going to be where you want to look, okay? Most of the Antminer ones are a little bit more inefficient. They were a little bit older. They were like mostly from like 2010-ish. A lot of these came out more in like the 2020s, okay? You're going to have like half the power draw for the same amount of hash on these newer Gold Shells compared to some of these older Antminers. I'm not too familiar with the IB Link hardware yet, but the one I do see in discussion the most currently is the Gold Shells, okay? There's several different models. There's multiple. There's also make these ones called, what are they? HS boxes, okay? They were to mine something called Handshake, which is another altcoin that I think used SHA-3X and Blake2b or something like that. But they essentially have a firmware bypass that allowed you to alternatively mine Sia coin by just only using the Blake2b chips. The Blake2b hash rate on them is pretty solid. Hash rate is not really comparable between algorithms, so don't bother too much trying to compare like the hash rate of like your SHA-256 BitAxe to your Blake2b Gold Shell ASIC or anything like that. So how can we prepare for this hard fork not really knowing too much about how it's actually going to be structured yet? Obviously, none of this is financial advice. There is some risk in purchasing these miners at this point since we haven't confirmed compatibility. You could end up with one where something in the firmware prevents it from working correctly with the gateway and you're not able to receive block templates properly, or it's not able to return like valid hashes back or something like that. So we do have to wait and see a little bit, but a couple steps you could go through. One, acquire some kind of Sia miner if you want to play it kind of on the riskier side, or wait for compatibility lists to come out. But by the time they do, I'm guessing these miners will probably be a little bit more expensive than they are now. Two, if you don't already, you're going to need your own node running knots, the newest version specifically for the BIP-110 chain. Many of you may not have the hardware to run 2 Bitcoin nodes or run Core and run knots or something like that. Well, you can use a prune node actually, so that is an option. If you have a smaller piece of hardware, you'd be able to use a prune node. And you can get down to like 10 gigs for the total block storage on those. And then you're going to also need on some piece of equipment a datum gateway pointed at that node. So with datum, the idea is they're going to create your own block templates that get submitted to the mining pool, or if you're solo mining, you're creating the block templates using your own nodes, filters, and everything like that. So with datum, the idea is that this will essentially act as like a translation layer between your Sia ASICs and the new Bitcoin chain in order for the different header sizes and everything to play nicely together. We don't know exactly what that's going to look like yet, but what I would recommend while we're waiting for all this to happen is get your knots node synced, get it down to a prune node if you need it, get datum set up in its current state with SHA-256. If you have SHA-256 miners, you can play around with datum and try to understand it a little bit better, just get used to configuring with it. And then essentially, once you have your whole stack of miners, node, datum ready, at that point, I just sit and wait. I wait for information on when we're going to start seeing updates for these nodes to handle the proof of work change, when they're targeting activation, that sort of thing. I would recommend trying to jump the gun on having those ready as soon as possible. Like my idea personally is, for what I'm thinking of, is prior to them targeting activation, whether it's like an hour or two before, I'm going to fire up all those ASICs before the network even goes live, and I'm going to point them at my datum node that's not even set up for the proof of work change yet. And they're probably just going to give me an error message like, hey, we can't process whatever block header this is, we can't talk to the Stratum instance or anything like that. I'm not too sure exactly how it is set up, but my idea is I'll get all the ASICs pointed to the IP address of the datum gateway, have it all ready, so the second my datum gateway restarts with the update for the proof of work change, I'm mining blocks. And I'm initially going to try and target solo mining. I'll probably show you guys some of my hardware setup once I get some of it in. I'm waiting for most of my miners and my power supplies and everything to come in. It's not going to be a crazy large setup. I'm targeting probably like 3.5 terahash if I'm lucky. I guess we'll see. It's also going to depend on how Datum handles everything, and if there's any kind of hash difference between Sia and these new blocks. But I am kind of excited to see what happens. Again, just to wrap up, if you are looking to potentially get into this, 3 things I would do prior to the fork actually happening. Get your knots node synced, get a couple Sia ASICs, maybe try your luck with different manufacturers in case one doesn't work out. That might not be the worst idea. Get your datum set up, get it configured, get it set in there with like your own Coinbase tag and everything like that. So if you do win blocks, my hope is that people will be able to find this channel and potentially even this video from future blocks I mine using my datum node that has Connor's lab as the Coinbase tag. I think that would be pretty awesome. So anyways, guys, I'm excited to see how this unfolds. Again, I'm gonna try and stay out of possibly picking sides here, whether it comes to the BIP-110 chain or the core. But let me know in the comments down below what you guys are kind of doing in your own setups, what you're looking at. Are you gonna sell your core chain stack and then only buy this new BIP-110 coin? I've heard of some people doing that. I don't know if I'm gonna personally do anything like that, but I am excited to see just kind of how this whole thing unfolds. It feels very theatrical. It's kind of just interesting to watch. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you want to see more Bitcoin content, if you want to see more content about the BIP-110 chain or just mining in general, make sure to subscribe. I'm gonna probably try to balance this with some other kinds of content. So it's not gonna be all Bitcoin. It's not gonna be all tech. It's gonna be kind of a mix of things. I guess we'll just have to see, but I hope you guys enjoyed, and I will catch you in the next one.